The fog does not lift that morning. It sits low over the valley like something waiting to be asked to leave, and inside it, a horse the color of wet iron stands motionless at the fence line, watching a road that has never once brought him anything good. Somewhere behind him, a woman steps out onto a porch that groans under her boots, and for a long moment, she simply watches the horse watch the road, as if the two of them share a language no one else in the world still speaks. Then, far off, engines. 3 of them. Black, expensive, wrong for this place the way a suit is wrong for a funeral held in a barn. The horse's ears swivel first. Then his whole body stiffens, for 1,000 pounds of muscle deciding, in half a second, whether today is the day everything ends. Before you keep watching, a quick question worth sitting with. What would you do if the one thing left of someone you loved could be taken from you by a man who has never once had to lose anything? Hold on to that question. It matters more than it seems right now. If this story finds something in you, tap like, subscribe before the fog burns off, and drop the name of your city in the comments. You will want to see how many others are watching this valley with you by the time it's over. Now, back to the road, and the cars getting closer. The rehabilitation sanctuary sits 9 miles past where the county stopped paving roads, in a fold of the Oregon hills where the light arrives late and leaves early, filtered through cedar and a mist that never fully commits to becoming rain. Lorelei has lived here for 22 years, and for the last 4 of them, she has lived here alone, in the sense that matters. The ranch house still holds 2 coffee mugs on the drying rack out of habit rather than need. The second boot tray by the door has not been moved. Nobody visits long enough to ask her why. She is 48, though the valley has aged her the way valleys tend to age people who work outdoors and grieve indoors. Hands rougher than they should be, hair pulled back with no interest in how it looks, a way of standing that suggests she has spent years bracing for weather that hasn't arrived yet. The sanctuary itself is modest by any standard that matters to a bank. 11 horses, for goats nobody remembers adopting. A barn with a roofline that dips in the middle like a tired spine, and a single paddock reserved, always, for one animal who does not mix with the others. Sovereign, a dapple gray stallion with a scar along his left flank and eyes that track movement the way a soldier tracks doorways. He came to the sanctuary broken in ways veterinarians have language for and ways they don't. Lorelei rebuilt him slowly, over months. The same months she rebuilt herself after the accident that took her husband, Callum, off this same land, in this same fog, on a morning that started exactly like this one and ended with her running across 300 yards of frozen pasture too late to matter. She does not talk about that morning. The town does not need her to. Everyone within 20 miles already knows the shape of it. The fence rail that gave way, the horse that spooked, the truck that arrived 7 minutes after the ambulance could have made a difference. What nobody in town knows, because she has never once said it aloud, is that Sovereign was the horse standing nearest Callum when it happened, and that for the first 8 months afterward, she could not look at the animal without her hands shaking. She kept him anyway. Some penances are private. Some horses are the only ones who remember your husband's voice. The sanctuary survives on grants that shrink every year, on donated hay, on the goodwill of a handful of retired ranchers who bring their own arthritic geldings here for what the county clinic calls equine-assisted therapy and what the ranchers themselves simply call the only thing that still makes their mornings worth getting up for. There is Hollis, 71, who has not spoken more than 4 consecutive sentences to another human since his wife passed, but who talks to the horses in long, unbroken paragraphs. There is Dot, who drives 40 minutes each way twice a week because her grandson, back from 2 tours he doesn't discuss, will only leave the house to come here. The sanctuary is not a business. It has never once turned a profit. It has, for years, simply survived on the stubbornness of a woman who refuses to let one more thing be taken from this land. That stubbornness is currently under a siege it cannot win. 6 months ago, the note on the property changed hands. A regional bank sold the sanctuary's accumulated debt, decades of small loans against feed, fencing, a barn roof repair, a well pump, to an investment fund out of Seattle, and the fund did what funds do. It consolidated, it called, it set a date. 90 days from now, unless the debt is paid in full, the entire valley, the barn, the paddocks, the cabin where Hollis's granddaughter learned to ride, the ground where Callum is buried under a stand of cedar Lorelei planted herself, goes to auction. The name attached to the fund is Pierce Ashwood. Nobody in the valley has met him. They have only seen the renderings, leaked from a county zoning meeting, of what the land becomes if he wins: a wellness resort, reclaimed timber lodges, a spa built where the round pen currently stands. Sovereign's paddock, according to the plans, becomes a decorative pond. This morning, the fog is not yet burned off when the 3 black vehicles turn off the county road and start up the long gravel drive. And Lorelei is already standing in the yard before they arrive, not because she was told they were coming, but because some part of her has been standing there, braced, for 6 months. The lead car stops at a careful, deliberate distance from the fence. A man gets out first, mid-30s, tailored down to the stitching, a leather folio under one arm, already talking before his door is fully shut, already narrating the property to someone on a call as though it belongs to him already. His name, though she does not yet know it, is Denholm, and he carries himself like a man who has never once in his life needed anyone else's forgiveness. Behind him, a second door opens more slowly. Pierce Ashwood steps out into the fog like a man stepping into cold water he has decided not to react to. He is younger than the industry profile suggests, and paler, with the particular carefulness of someone recently returned to walking longer distances than his body is comfortable with. He does not check his phone. He does not look at Denholm. He looks, instead, past the fence, toward the paddock at the far edge of the yard, where a gray stallion has gone very still, watching him the way prey watches something it has not yet decided is a predator. Lorelei's hand finds the top rail of the fence without her looking at it. She has done this 1,000 times. It means, not yet. It means, wait. Denholm starts toward the barn first, folio open, listing square footage like an incantation. Pierce does not follow him. Pierce keeps walking, slow, toward the paddock, toward the horse, and something in the way he moves. No hurry, no performance. The gait of a man who has recently learned that his own body can betray him without warning. Makes Lorelei's stomach fold in on itself before he has said a single word. She crosses the yard fast enough that gravel spits from under her boots. Sovereign's ears pin flat. His weight shifts back onto his hindquarters. 12 feet from the fence, close enough now that the fog seems to part around him, Pierce lifts one gloved hand toward the top rail, and the whole valley seems to hold its breath at once. She reaches the fence before he does, close enough that her shoulder is nearly against his arm, and for a moment neither of them acknowledges the other, both watching the horse instead, as though the animal is the only honest party present. Sovereign has not moved, but everything about him has changed. His nostrils flare wide with each breath. A tremor runs the length of his neck and settles nowhere. Don't touch him. The words come out low, without performance, without the courtesy small talk usually demands of strangers. Pierce's hand stops 6 inches from the rail. He looks at her properly for the first time, not at her clothes, not at the modest house behind her, but at her face, the way a man reads weather before deciding whether to sail. Denholm's voice carries from the barn, something about square footage and load-bearing beams, entirely unaware that the actual negotiation of the morning is happening 40 yards away, in silence, between a woman and a horse she has not let anyone near in 4 years. Pierce lowers his hand. He does not step back from the fence, but he does not push forward either, and the small concession costs him something visible. A flicker at the jaw, the look of a man unaccustomed to being told no by anyone who isn't billing him for the privilege. He's not for sale with the land, she says, before he can ask. Everything's for sale with the land, Pierce answers. Not unkindly, just factually, the way he has likely said it in 40 boardrooms before this one, a sentence with the weight of a signature already behind it. Sovereign's front hoof strikes the mud once, hard, a single warning percussion, and both of them go still. Lorelei's hand rises slowly, not toward Pierce, not toward the fence, but out flat in the fog between herself and the horse, palm down, fingers loose. She says a single word, old and low, a syllable that sounds more like breath than language, something passed to her by a grandfather who broke horses on this same land 70 years before either of these two people were born. The stallion's weight drops back onto all 4 legs. His ears come forward, not soft, but no longer flattened. He does not relax. He simply, for the moment, chooses not to explode. Pierce watches this the way a man watches a card trick he cannot find the seam in. His eyes move from the horse to the woman's hand, still raised, still steady, and something in his expression shifts from impatience into something quieter, something closer to attention. "That's a hell of a party trick," he says. "It's not a trick. No, I don't suppose it is." He studies her for a moment longer than the conversation requires, long enough that Denholm's voice, still narrating from the barn, becomes background noise neither of them is listening to anymore. There is a stillness in Pierce that does not match the folder tucked under Denholm's arm, or the black cars, or the 90-day letter that arrived at this house 6 weeks ago with a font too clean for the news it carried. He looks, standing at this fence, less like a man here to inspect an asset and more like a man who has wandered, without entirely meaning to, into the one place on his itinerary that isn't going to behave the way his itinerary expects. Denholm's footsteps crunch back across the yard, folio snapping shut. He informs Pierce, without lowering his voice, that the outbuildings are worse than the report indicated and that the whole parcel needs an environmental reassessment before the resort's foundation plans can move forward. And somewhere in the middle of that sentence his eyes land on the horse, and his expression changes the way a man's expression changes when he stops seeing an animal and starts seeing a line item. "That's the liability they flagged," Denholm says, nodding at Sovereign the way a man nods at a crack in a foundation. "Big animal like that. Unpredictable. Someone gets hurt on this property before we close. The whole valuation shifts. I'd recommend." He doesn't finish the sentence, because Pierce has already turned and started walking back toward the car, and the movement is abrupt enough that even Sovereign's ears track him the whole way, uncertain whether the retreat is real. At the car door, Pierce pauses. He looks back once, not at Lorelei, not at Denholm, but at the horse, standing exactly where he was standing before any of them arrived, watching the road the way he has watched it every morning since the accident, waiting for something that isn't coming back. "We'll be in touch about the timeline," Pierce says, to no one in particular, and gets in the car. The engines pull away down the long drive, gravel popping under the tires, fog swallowing the taillights within 100 yards, and Lorelei stands at the fence long after the sound has gone, one hand still resting on the top rail, watching the empty road the way you watch a wound to see if it's actually going to bleed. Behind her, Sovereign lowers his head at last and exhales, long and low, the closest thing to relief a horse's body can offer, and it is only then, in the afterquiet, that she allows her own shoulders to drop half an inch, the only sign, in 22 years of holding this land together alone, that anyone might have noticed she was afraid. The call comes 4 days later, not from Denholm, but from Pierce himself, and the number surprises her enough that she lets it ring twice before answering. His voice on the phone carries none of the boardroom cadence Denholm wears like cologne. He asks, without preamble, whether she would allow him to return to the property, alone, without his associate, without the folio, to look at the horse again. She does not ask why. She has learned, over the years, that people who need a thing rarely announce the need directly. They announce a smaller, adjacent thing, and the real hunger shows up later, in how they behave once they think no one is measuring them. She tells him he can come, on one condition: he does not go near the paddock without her standing beside him. He arrives the next morning without Denholm, without the black convoy, driving a single rented truck up the gravel himself, badly, stalling once at the cattle guard in a way that makes Hollis, feeding the goats nearby, laugh out loud for the first time in what Lorelei estimates is several weeks. Pierce steps out dressed differently than before. Plainer, a jacket too new to have ever seen a barn, boots that still have their retail sheen. And there is something almost endearing in the mismatch, a man trying, visibly, to dress for a world he doesn't belong to. He stands at the fence rail where he stood 4 days earlier, hands in his pockets, watching Sovereign graze at the far end of the paddock, and for a long while neither of them says anything at all. The fog is thinner today, burning off in patches, letting actual sunlight fall across the wet grass in broken pieces. "You said it wasn't a trick," he says finally. "It's trust, built over years. It's the opposite of a trick." He nods slowly, the way a man nods at information he isn't sure what to do with yet. His eyes stay on the horse. Denholm thinks he should be put down, or sold off to someone with the facility to handle him. He's not wrong that the liability's real. Insurance actuaries don't care how much trust took to build. Lorelei's jaw tightens, but her voice stays level, the way it has stayed level through 6 months of letters, and calls designed to make her feel like the unreasonable party in her own life. He's not going anywhere. Pierce is quiet for a moment. Then, without asking permission, without announcing the intention the way a careful man would, he steps toward the fence rail, closer than 4 days ago, close enough that his chest nearly touches the top board, and lifts his hand toward the latch of the gate. Lorelai's whole body turns toward him, the warning already forming in her throat, one word rising up the same way it rose 4 days ago. But this time something in the paddock moves before she can speak it. Sovereign lifts his head from the grass. He does not startle. He does not flatten his ears or strike the ground in warning. Instead, slowly, deliberately, he walks toward the fence, toward the gate, toward the man with his hand on the latch, and stops less than a foot away, close enough that his breath fogs visibly in the cool morning air against the fabric of Pierce's new jacket. Lorelai's hand freezes on the rail. She has seen this horse charge grown men off this property. She has seen him refuse contact with anyone but her for 4 straight years. And here he is, unbidden, closing the last distance himself, lowering his great gray head until his forehead rests, gently, directly against the center of Pierce's chest. Exactly, precisely, over the place where a thin surgical scar sits hidden beneath 2 layers of fabric, a scar from an operation that took place 11 weeks ago, one that almost nobody outside a single hospital in Seattle knows occurred at all. Pierce does not move. His hand, still raised toward the latch, hangs frozen in the air. His breathing, audible now in the stillness, begins to slow, not by his own effort, but as if pulled downward, matched, entrained by the enormous, deliberate rhythm of the animal's own breath against his sternum. For breaths. 6. Lorelai watches the horse's ribcage expand and contract in long, unhurried waves, and watches Pierce's shoulders, rigid a moment ago, begin, involuntarily, to fall into the same slow rhythm, as if his body has recognized something his mind has not yet caught up to. Nobody in the valley moves. Hollis has stopped scattering feed for the goats and stands frozen by the gate, watching. Somewhere behind the house, a truck engine idles, forgotten. And Pierce Ashwood, a man whose entire professional existence has been built on never once appearing unsteady in front of anyone, stands in the mud of a failing ranch with a stallion's forehead pressed against a wound he has told no one about, and does not, for a long, unbearable moment, trust himself to speak. The horse steps back first. He does it the same way he approached, unhurried, deliberate, without apology, and returns to the far end of the paddock as if nothing extraordinary has happened at all, as if he has simply completed a task assigned to him long before any of these people arrived. Pierce does not move for several seconds afterward. His hand, still raised toward the latch, drops slowly to his side. When he finally turns to look at Lorelai, his face has lost whatever careful composure carried him up the drive that morning, and something rawer sits underneath it. Not fear exactly, but its close cousin, the look of a man who has just been handed proof of something he has spent 11 weeks trying to convince himself wasn't real. "You knew he'd do that," he says. "It isn't quite a question. I didn't know anything. He's never done that. Not with anyone but me. Not once in 4 years." Pierce looks back toward the horse, now grazing again at the paddock's far fence line, as though the last 90 seconds never occurred. His hand drifts, almost involuntarily, to his own chest, resting flat over the fabric where the scar sits beneath. How would he know? He starts, and stops himself before finishing the sentence, as if saying the rest of it out loud would make something true that he has been working very hard, for 11 weeks, to keep untrue. Lorelai studies him now the way she studies a spooked animal, not with pity, which would insult him, but with the clinical patience of someone who has spent years learning to read what bodies say when mouths refuse to. The pallor under his tan, the careful, measured way he moves, like a man whose doctor has told him not to strain himself and who has, for once in his life, actually listened. The way his hand keeps returning to his sternum, unconsciously, each time the conversation edges toward the horse's behavior. "Hart," she says, not as an accusation, just a fact laid on the table between them, the way you'd lay down a card in a game neither of you agreed to start. Pierce's eyes come up sharply, and for a moment the boardroom returns to his face, controlled, defensive, ready to close a door before anyone can see through it. Then, just as quickly, it drains back out of him, as though maintaining the performance costs more than he currently has to spend. Cardiac arrest, he says quietly. 11 weeks ago, in a hotel room in Zurich, alone, closing a deal that doesn't matter to a single person on earth except the 6 board members who needed it to go through on schedule. They found me on the floor of a hotel bathroom, and I was gone for almost 4 minutes before anyone got a pulse back. Surgery 2 days later. Nobody outside the hospital and 2 members of my board know it happened. As far as the market is concerned, I was in Zurich negotiating, which, in a sense, I was. The confession sits in the cold morning air between them, unadorned, offered without the polish he clearly applies to everything else in his life. Somewhere behind them, a goat bleats, and the ordinary sound seems almost obscene against what he has just said. "Why tell me?" Lorelei asks. Pierce doesn't answer right away. He looks toward the paddock again, toward the horse who found the wound beneath his shirt without ever being told it existed. And when he finally speaks, his voice has lost the last of its boardroom register entirely, because he already knew. So there didn't seem to be much point in pretending with the rest of you. Denholm returns to the valley 3 days later, and this time he does not wait to be invited past the gate. He arrives with a different folio, thicker, and a woman from the fund's legal team who says almost nothing the entire visit. Only takes photographs of the paddock fencing with a phone held at exactly the angle a courtroom would find useful. Lorelei watches them from the porch, arms crossed, while Hollis's granddaughter's rescued gelding paces nervously in the round pen nearby, unsettled by strangers the way most of the sanctuary's animals are. Denholm's opening line, once he's close enough to be heard without shouting, is not a greeting. It's a number, the current appraised value of the land if cleared of livestock and outbuildings versus the appraised value with an active, uninsured liability like sovereigns still occupying prime acreage. He delivers it the way other men might recite a psalm, with the same unwavering faith that the numbers alone settle every argument that matters. "Mr. Ashwood asked me to review the incident from Tuesday," Denholm says, tapping the folio as though it contains a transcript of something Lorelei was not personally present for. An animal of that size making unsupervised contact with a principal of the fund is exactly the kind of exposure legal flagged 8 weeks ago. I don't think you understand what a single incident report could do to this timeline. Or to you. Frankly, if he'd been hurt. He wasn't hurt. This time. Denholm's smile does not reach anywhere near his eyes. Next time, maybe he is. And then it isn't just the debt on this property that becomes your problem. It's a lawsuit big enough to take the shirt off your back along with the barn. Behind him, the legal associate lowers her phone and glances, briefly, toward the main house, as though gauging whether the threat needs reinforcement from a second voice. Lorelei says nothing. She has learned, across 22 years of ranch auctions, drought years, and one funeral that emptied the valley of half its goodwill, that the worst thing you can hand an aggressor is a reaction they can quote back to a judge. Denholm takes her silence as an opening rather than a wall. Here's what happens if you're smart about this. The fund pays off the note in full. Every dollar, gone. Today, if you want it, in exchange for full transfer of the horse. Not the land. Just him. We have a facility in Nevada, professionally staffed, better equipped to manage an animal with his history than a woman running a charity operation on donated hay. You keep the ranch. You keep your life here. The horse becomes someone else's controlled risk instead of yours. The offer lands with the practiced ease of a man who has made versions of it 100 times before, in 100 negotiations where the other party eventually folded because the math simply made more sense than the feeling. For a long moment, Lorelei says nothing at all, and Denholm, mistaking silence for consideration, allows himself the smallest satisfied nod. Then she tells him no. It isn't loud. It isn't even particularly emphatic. It is, instead, the flat, immovable no of a woman who has already run every version of this calculation in the 2 sleepless nights since his last visit and has already found the bottom of it. Denholm's expression shifts from confident to incredulous, the particular incredulity of a man who has just watched someone turn down an amount of money that, by any rational measure, should have ended the conversation. "You understand what you're choosing," he says. "The debt, the auction, all of it, versus a horse. He's not a horse to me, and he won't survive somewhere else. Some animals die of things that don't show up on an X-ray." Denholm's jaw works for a moment, some retort forming and then, visibly, being reconsidered. He He closes the folio with a sharp snap, the sound cutting across the yard like a small gavel. "I'll deliver that to Mr. Ashwood exactly as you said it," he tells her, though something in his tone suggests he intends to deliver it in a considerably less generous translation. The clock's still running either way. 90 days becomes 64 as of this morning. He turns and walks back toward the car, the legal associate a half step behind him, and it is only once the engine has faded down the gravel drive that Lorelei allows herself to sit down on the porch step, hands pressed flat against her knees, breathing the way you breathe after holding something heavy far longer than your arms were built for. Pierce arrives that evening, alone again, without warning, and finds her still on the porch step in the fading light, a mug of coffee gone cold beside her that she has clearly forgotten about an hour ago. He stands at the bottom of the steps for a moment before she acknowledges him, long enough to make clear that whatever brought him back tonight was not scheduled. "Denholm told me about the offer," he says. "And your answer?" She doesn't look up right away. When she finally does, her eyes are dry, but there's an exhaustion in them that 4 days of pleasant weather and one strange, quiet moment at a fence line have done nothing to soften. "Then you already know where I stand." "I do." He sits down on the step below her, uninvited, close enough that the distance between two very different lives suddenly feels smaller than either of them planned for. "I also know he pitched it as generous. Full debt forgiveness for one animal. On paper, it probably reads like the deal of the decade. It's not his to buy. No." He looks out toward the paddock, where Sovereign stands in the near dark, a pale shape against the deepening blue of dusk. It's not. For a while, neither of them says anything. The valley does its evening work around them. Crickets starting somewhere in the tall grass. A barn owl announcing itself from the tree line. The particular hush that settles over a ranch once the animals have been fed and the light has gone the color of a bruise. Pierce breaks the silence first, and when he does, his voice has none of the polish it carried during their first meeting at the fence. "I've spent 11 weeks pretending nothing happened in that hotel room. Told my board it was exhaustion. Told the market it was a scheduling issue. Told myself, mostly, that if I just kept moving fast enough, none of it would catch up to me. And then a horse who has apparently never let a stranger within 10 feet of him walks up and puts his head against the one part of my body I've told exactly 4 people about. And I don't have a framework for that. I've never once, in my life, encountered a problem money couldn't eventually out-negotiate. You think this is a negotiation? I think I don't know what this is. That's the honest answer. And I'm not used to saying that out loud to anyone." Lorelei studies him in the dying light, the particular unguarded posture of a man who has spent a career learning to control every visible signal his body sends, and who is, for the first time and longer than he can probably measure, failing to control this one. Something in her softens, fractionally, not toward the offer, not toward the fund, but toward the man sitting one step below her, visibly frightened of something no boardroom has ever prepared him to survive. "If you want to understand what he responded to," she says finally, "you don't buy it. You earn it. And it takes longer than 3 days usually allow for." Pierce is quiet for a long moment, watching the horse fade further into the dark blue of the coming night. "What if I had 3 days?" he says. "What would that even look like?" The proposal she makes the next morning is not one either of them expected to be making a week ago, and she delivers it standing at the paddock fence, arms crossed. The terms laid out with the flat precision of a woman who has decided that if she is going to lose this fight, she is at least going to lose it on her own conditions rather than someone else's. 3 days, she tells him. "You show up here every morning at dawn. You muck stalls, you carry feed, you groom him, you clean his hooves, you do every unglamorous thing this work actually requires, and you do it without an assistant, without your phone, without Denholm anywhere near this property. At the end of 3 days, if you can get a saddle on that horse's back without force, without a twitch, without sedation, without anyone but the 2 of you in that round pen, the ranch is yours. I'll sign whatever transfer your lawyers put in front of me. And if I can't, then you tear up the note. All of it. The whole debt, forgiven, and you and your fund never set foot on this land again." Denholm would call this insane, Pierce says, something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. No collateral, no legal language, just a horse and a stopwatch. That's the whole point. Some things you can't put a lien on. He extends his hand, and after a pause that lasts just slightly too long, she takes it, and the handshake is oddly formal for 2 people standing in mud, in fog, staking an entire valley on whether a wounded animal decides to trust a stranger before a bank forecloses on a woman's grief. The first morning goes badly. Pierce arrives on time, dressed correctly this time, boots already scuffed from some effort to break them in overnight. But his movements in the barn are stiff, overcorrected, the movements of a man following instructions rather than understanding them. Sovereign will not let him within arm's length of the stall. Every attempt to approach ends the same way. Ears back, weight shifted, a single sharp stamp of a front hoof that sends Pierce retreating half a step before he's told to. By mid-afternoon, sweating through a shirt that has already lost its retail creases, he sits down hard on an overturned feed bucket outside the stall and puts his head in his hands, and Lorelei, watching from the barn doorway, says nothing, because some lessons only take hold once a person has exhausted every version of the wrong approach first. "You're trying to convince him," she says eventually. "He doesn't care about convincing. He cares whether you're honest." I don't know what that means in horse terms. It doesn't mean anything in horse terms. It means the same thing it means in every other terms. Stop performing calm. Either you are, or you're not. And he already knows which one it is before you open the gate. The second morning arrives under a fine, persistent rain, the kind that soaks through a jacket collar within minutes and turns the yard to a soft brown paste under every boot that crosses it. Pierce shows up anyway, earlier than required, already at the barn door when Lorelei crosses the yard with the morning's first bucket of feed, and something in the set of his shoulders has changed overnight. Less rigid, less braced, the posture of a man who has stopped trying to win an argument and started simply showing up. He works the stalls in silence for the better part of the morning, and by midday, something shifts. He is crouched beside Sovereign's near foreleg, brush in hand, working slow, careful strokes through the horse's coat exactly as she showed him the day before, and the horse, for the first time in 2 days, does not pull away. He stands. He lets the brush move down his shoulder, along his ribs, past the place where Pierce's own scar sits hidden beneath layers of soaked fabric, and something about the parallel. The wound the horse carries in his history, the wound the man carries in his chest, both of them standing in the rain, both of them, for one unguarded moment, simply allowing themselves to be touched without flinching, breaks something loose in Pierce that 11 weeks of careful denial has kept perfectly sealed. His hands stop moving. His shoulders drop. And then, without warning, without the composure that has carried him through boardrooms, hospital corridors, and a resurrection he told almost no one about, he sits down hard in the mud beside the horse and puts both hands over his face, and his shoulders shake in a way that has nothing to do with the cold rain soaking through his collar. Lorelei does not go to him right away. She has learned, across years of watching broken things heal at their own pace, that the kindest thing you can sometimes offer a person is the space to fall apart without an audience rushing to stitch them back together too soon. She waits at the barn door, arms crossed against the rain, until his breathing evens out, until his hands come away from his face, red-eyed, and only then does she cross the yard and sit down in the mud beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touch, not saying anything at all. "I was dead for almost 4 minutes," he says finally, voice raw in a way she hasn't heard from him yet. Nobody talks about what that actually feels like. Not the medical part. The part where you come back and every single thing you built your identity around, the deals, the timelines, the fund, all of it, suddenly looks like furniture in a house that's already burned down. I've been terrified since the day I woke up in that hospital bed. Every single day. And I have not told one person that until right now, in the mud, next to a horse. Lorelei watches Sovereign, standing patient and still above them both in the rain, his great head lowered, ears soft, watching the two humans at his feet the way he has watched very little else in 4 years without wanting to bolt. "He's not scared of you anymore," she says quietly. That's not nothing. Denholm does not wait for the 3 days to run their course. On the morning of the second day, while Pierce is still in the barn with mud drying stiff on his knees, a courier arrives at the county courthouse 40 minutes away, filing an emergency motion on behalf of the fund requesting an immediate injunction. Cause: an unregistered, unrestrained animal of documented aggressive history posing an active and continuing risk to persons and property pending sale, requiring court-ordered removal or humane euthanasia within 72 hours pending review. The papers reach Lorelei by certified mail that same afternoon, delivered by a courier who will not meet her eyes as he hands over the envelope, and she reads them standing in the yard with her boots still caked from the morning's chores. The fine print doing exactly what fine print is designed to do, turning a living, breathing, complicated animal into a single flattened phrase, documented aggressive history. She finds the attached exhibit before she finishes the first page. A video file, time-stamped from 3 weeks earlier, grainy, shot from an angle just outside the paddock fence, showing Sovereign rearing hard against the rail, striking out at a figure just out of frame. The footage cut before it shows what provoked him or how it ended. There is no context in the filing. There is only the single terrifying image of a stallion in mid-rear, legs flailing, presented as evidence of a danger that requires no further explanation because the image alone does the arguing. She does not need to guess who filmed it. 3 weeks ago, Hollis's grandson came by unannounced, agitated in the particular way his post-deployment afternoons sometimes turn, and startled Sovereign badly enough with a slammed truck door that the horse reared once before Lorelei got between them and calmed him inside of 90 seconds. Nobody was hurt. Nobody filed a report. And nobody, as far as she knew, had a camera running at the time. Except, apparently, someone did, positioned with a precision that suggests surveillance rather than coincidence. Pierce finds her an hour later, still standing in the yard with the papers in her hand. And the moment he reads the filing over her shoulder, something in his face changes entirely. The last remaining traces of the man who arrived here in a black convoy a week ago draining out of him and leaving behind something colder, harder, and entirely unfamiliar to her. Who authorized this? He says, and his voice has none of the exhaustion of the barn or the rain. It has the clean, flat register of a man about to make several very expensive phone calls. Denholm's name, of course, sits at the bottom of the filing, but Pierce does not need her confirmation. He is already dialing before she finishes the sentence, and the call that follows, standing in the middle of the yard while Sovereign paces the far end of his paddock, uneasy at the tension in the air even from 100 feet away, is short, exact, and utterly without mercy. He tells Denholm, in a voice Lorelei has not heard from him yet, that the footage was taken without authorization on private property during an active good-faith negotiation Denholm was explicitly excluded from, and that filing it as evidence in a court motion without disclosing the full context, the truck door, the provocation, the 90 seconds of calm that followed, constitutes exactly the kind of manufactured liability that gets a fund's entire legal department disbarred if a judge ever bothers to ask the second question instead of just the first. He does not shout. He does not need to. By the time the call ends, Denholm has been informed, in terms that leave no room for negotiation, that his employment with the fund concluded the moment that filing was submitted, and that Pierce will personally appear before the same court within the week to withdraw the motion and correct the record. Lorelei watches him lower the phone, chest still rising and falling with the particular effort of a man whose heart, only 11 weeks removed from stopping altogether, is working harder than any doctor would currently recommend. That wasn't a small thing you just did, she says. It was an easy thing, once I understood what I was actually protecting. He looks toward the paddock, toward the horse still pacing at the fence line, unsettled by an argument he can sense but cannot understand. It just took me longer than it should have to see what that was. The third morning arrives clear for the first time in a week, the fog finally lifting off the valley floor by mid-morning to reveal hills gone a deep, saturated green from all the rain. And there is a stillness to the ranch that feels less like calm and more like the held breath before a decision. Denholm's motion has been withdrawn, the video footage stricken from any future filing. But the underlying deadline, the debt, the auction, the 90 days now down to a number that fits on one hand, has not moved an inch. Whatever happens in the round pen this morning happens with the full weight of that number sitting on both their shoulders. Lorelei stands at the rail with a saddle over one arm, worn leather gone soft and dark with decades of use. The same saddle Callum used to carry across this same yard on mornings that now feel like they belong to an entirely different life. She has not let anyone touch this saddle since the accident. She does not explain this to Pierce. She simply holds it out to him, and something in his face, taking the weight of it into his own arms, suggests he understands the gesture carries meaning far beyond the leather itself. Sovereign stands in the center of the round pen, watching the gate the way he has watched every gate in 4 years, waiting to see whether what comes through it deserves to stay. Pierce enters slowly, saddle in one arm, and does not approach directly. He has learned this much, at least, over 3 days of failure and one collapse in the ring, that approaching a frightened thing head-on only confirms its fear. He moves instead along the perimeter of the pen, unhurried, letting the horse track him with his eyes rather than his whole body, letting the distance between them close by inches rather than intention. Sovereign's ears flick, once, toward him, then away, then back again. A conversation happening entirely in the language of small movements that Lorelei, watching from the rail, reads the way another person might read a page of dialogue. She says nothing. This part is no longer hers to narrate. Pierce stops 8 feet away and simply stands there, saddle held loose against his hip, and waits. A full minute passes. Then another. The horse shifts his weight, considers walking away, and does not. Instead, slowly, on his own terms, at his own pace, Sovereign takes one step closer. Then another. Until the distance between them has closed to almost nothing, until the horse's breath is warm and visible in the cool morning air against the front of Pierce's jacket, in nearly the exact position it found 11 days ago, over the scar neither of them has spoken about since the rain. Pierce lifts the saddle slowly, giving the horse every possible second to object, and lays it gently across his back. Sovereign does not rear. He does not bolt. He does not so much as shift his weight in protest. He simply stands, ears forward, tail loose, while the saddle settles into place and the girth is drawn snug beneath his belly by hands that, 3 days ago, did not know how to hold a brush without gripping it like a weapon. At the rail, Lorelei's hand rises to her mouth, and for the first time since the funeral 4 years ago, something in her chest gives way entirely, not in grief this time, but in something closer to its opposite, the specific, disorienting relief of watching something you were certain would break instead simply, quietly, hold. The moment does not last as long as either of them might have wanted it to. By the time Pierce leads Sovereign in one slow, unhurried circle around the round pen, saddle sitting easy across his back for the first time in 4 years, a fourth vehicle has already turned onto the gravel drive, unannounced, and the man who steps out of it before it has fully stopped is not Denholm. He introduces himself as senior counsel for the funds board, dispatched the moment word reached Seattle that Pierce had unilaterally terminated a fund officer and withdrawn an active court filing without board approval, and his tone carries the particular cold formality of a man sent to clean up a mess rather than to celebrate a resolution. He does not look at the horse. He does not look at the saddle, or the round pen, or the visible, undeniable proof standing 40 feet away that the 3-day wager has been won fairly and completely. He looks only at Pierce and informs him, in front of Lorelei, in front of Hollis and Dot and half the small crowd of ranchers who have gathered at the fence line to watch the morning's outcome, that any personal agreement made regarding fund-owned debt requires board ratification, and that the board, informed only hours ago of the wager's existence, has already voted, in an emergency session, to reject its terms entirely. The debt stands, the council says. The auction proceeds as scheduled, and Mr. Ashwood's continued involvement in this matter, given the conflict of interest now on record, is no longer welcome. For a moment, the yard goes entirely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on shoulders and quiets even the goats. Sovereign, sensing the shift in the air the way he senses every shift, tenses beneath the saddle, and Pierce's hand comes to rest, instinctively, flat against the horse's neck, a small, unconscious gesture of reassurance offered to an animal who, 3 days ago, would not have permitted it. Pierce does not raise his voice. He does not need to. He simply asks the council one question: whether the board is aware that the fund's own representative filed manufactured evidence in a court motion using unauthorized surveillance footage taken on private property, and watches the man's face shift, almost imperceptibly, from certainty to calculation. Then he tells the council, in the same flat, exact register he used with Denholm 3 days earlier, that he does not require the board's ratification to honor a personal debt of honor made on his own signature, and that if the fund wishes to pursue the auction over his objection, they can explain to a judge, in open court, exactly how that surveillance footage came to exist. The council's jaw tightens. He does not concede. Men like him rarely concede in front of an audience. But he does retreat, promising a formal response within the week, and climbs back into the car with considerably less certainty than he arrived with. The gravel drive falls quiet again, and in the round pen, Sovereign, saddle still resting easy across his back, lowers his head and exhales, long and slow, as though the entire valley has just remembered, together, how to breathe. The formal response arrives 6 days later, not as a threat this time, but as a settlement, delivered by an entirely different lawyer with an entirely different tone. The debt forgiven in full, the note marked satisfied, the fund's interest in the parcel withdrawn permanently, all of it signed not by the board, but by Pierce himself, using a clause buried deep in the fund's founding charter that grants its principal officer discretionary authority over debts below a certain threshold. A threshold this ranch's entire accumulated note fits comfortably beneath. He never fully explains to Lorelei how he found that clause, or how many hours he spent the previous night reading charter documents he had apparently never once bothered to read in the 8 years since founding the fund. She does not ask. Some victories, she has learned, are more meaningful left slightly unexamined. What she does learn, in the weeks that follow, watching him return to the valley on weekends that have nothing to do with debts or deadlines, is the quieter cost the whole ordeal left behind. He no longer moves through the world with the same untouched certainty he arrived with. There is a new carefulness in him, a willingness to sit with silence instead of filling it, a habit of checking, unconsciously, on the horse's whereabouts before settling into any conversation, as though some part of him now measures every room by whether Sovereign would feel safe in it. The valley does not fully forgive him either, not right away. Hollis remains wary for months, watching Pierce muck stalls on weekend mornings with the particular suspicion of a man who has seen wealthy strangers make promises before. Dot's grandson keeps his distance longer than anyone else, though eventually, on a quiet afternoon nobody photographs or comments on, he is the one who teaches Pierce how to properly clean a hoof pick, the two of them working in a silence that says more than either has managed to say to a new person in over a year. Lorelei herself carries her own unresolved weight through all of it. The debt is gone, the auction canceled, the land secure for the first time in 6 months, and still, some nights, she stands at the paddock fence long after dark, one hand on the rail, and finds herself speaking quietly to a horse who has never once, in 4 years, needed her to explain what it costs to keep loving something after it has already taken almost everything from you. The wound Callum's death carved into her has not closed. It has simply, finally, stopped bleeding quite so freely, which is not the same thing as healing, but is, some mornings, enough. It is Dot's grandson, 3 weeks after the settlement, who nearly undoes everything a second time. Restless one evening in a way none of them yet fully understand. He takes one of the sanctuary's gentler geldings out past the fence line, without telling anyone, riding hard and fast down toward the county road in a state none of the ranchers recognize until it's already becoming dangerous. The gelding startled, the road narrow, a delivery truck rounding the bend at the exact wrong moment. Sovereign is the one who reaches them first. Loose from his paddock through a gate someone forgot to latch, he crosses the field at a dead run and places himself directly between the panicked gelding and the road, absorbing the smaller horse's collision against his own shoulder rather than letting it carry through to the truck's path, taking a gash along his flank in the process that will scar, permanently, alongside the older one already there. Lorelei reaches them seconds after Pierce does, both of them running full out across wet grass in the fading light, and what she finds is not the tragedy her chest had already braced for on the run down, but instead a scraped, trembling young man being held upright by a horse who, for years ago, would not let anyone but her within 10 feet of him, and who now stands steady, bleeding, breathing hard, letting a stranger's shaking hands cling to his neck the way you cling to the one solid thing, left standing after everything else has gone sideways. The vet arrives within the hour. The wound requires stitches, but nothing more. Dot's grandson, once the shock passes, sits in the barn doorway for a long time afterward, saying nothing, and it is Pierce who eventually sits down beside him, offering no advice, no reassurance, just company, the same silent company Lorelei once offered him in the mud. The following spring, the valley looks different in ways that have nothing to do with new construction. The barn roof no longer dips in the middle. A second round pin has gone up beside the first, funded not by a fund spreadsheet, but by an actual working partnership Pierce quietly built between the sanctuary and a veterans outreach program 2 counties over. One that sends young men and women like Dot's grandson here on a rotating basis, not to be fixed, exactly, but to be around something that asks nothing of them except patience. Lorelei still runs the place. That was never negotiable, and Pierce, to his credit, never once tried to make it otherwise. He shows up most weekends still, mucking stalls and boots that have long since lost their retail shine, and something has settled into the rhythm of his visits that neither of them names out loud, though the whole valley has quietly noticed it. The way his hand finds the small of her back without thinking when they walk the fence line together at dusk. The way she has stopped setting out that second coffee mug from habit and started setting it out from something closer to intention. Sovereign still watches the road every morning. He has not stopped, and Lorelei suspects, quietly, that he never fully will. Some wounds simply become part of the architecture of a body, present but no longer load-bearing. But most mornings now, once his watch of the road is done, he crosses the paddock on his own, unbidden, and rests his head against the fence where Pierce stands waiting with the morning feed. The same gesture he offered a stranger in the fog 11 months ago, except now it is offered, each time, to someone he has chosen to recognize. The scar on Sovereign's flank from that night on the road has healed into a pale, permanent line beside the older one, and Lorelei catches herself, some evenings, running her hand along both of them at once, the old grief and the new one sitting side by side on the same animal, neither one erasing the other, both of them simply part of what he carried through, and what he is still, somehow, standing here to carry. The final piece of the story does not arrive in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in a quiet ceremony held at the edge of the cedar stand where Callum is buried, on the 1-year anniversary of the morning the black cars first came up the drive. There is no plaque, no announcement, nothing performed for an audience. Lorelei and Pierce simply plant a second row of young cedar saplings alongside the older ones, a gesture that means nothing to anyone passing by on the county road and means everything to the 2 people kneeling in the dirt beside them. Pierce, working the soil in with bare hands, admits, quietly, that he still sometimes wakes at night with his hand pressed flat against his own chest, checking, out of old habit, whether his heart is still doing what it's supposed to. Lorelei tells him, without performance, without softening it into something easier to hear, that the fear likely never fully leaves, that she still sometimes reaches for a second coffee mug before remembering, and that the goal was never to stop carrying what happened, only to find something worth carrying it alongside. Sovereign stands nearby in the last gold light of the afternoon, unbothered by the digging, watching the 2 of them the way he has watched this land for years, patient, scarred, present, and somewhere in that quiet, unremarkable moment, kneeling in the dirt beside the graves of one life and the beginnings of another, the truth of what happened here settles into something neither of them needs to say aloud. That real power was never in owning the valley, or forgiving the dead, or forcing a wounded animal into submission. It was always in the harder, rarer thing, having the courage to let something fragile see exactly who you are, and staying still long enough to let it decide, on its own terms, that you were worth trusting. If this story stayed with you, you know exactly what to do. Like it, subscribe for the next one, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Stories like Lorelei's exist in more places than we realize, quietly, in valleys nobody drives through on purpose, and every comment helps this one reach somebody who needs it. Thank you for staying until the very last frame.